Afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining today's live stream regarding digital transformation. Today's topic we're going to cover is digital transformation, customer rights and responsibilities. So, within a digital transformation, what are your rights and responsibilities within your transformation project? My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And we do these live streams every Tuesday, same time, same place on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So thank you for being here today. We're going to cover a lot of different topics here today. And I'm actually going to rely pretty heavily on the audience today to ask questions and jump in with comments. We don't have a guest. It's going to be me chatting with the audience here today. So really look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments as we get started here. Reason for today's conversation, or just to set the backdrop, is that most transformations fail, and there are reasons why transformations fail, obviously, and a lot of that has to do with what the customer themselves should be doing. So that's really the topic we're going to jump into here today is what are those responsibilities that clients or implementing organizations have, and what are their rights within digital transformation as well. Before we jump into the topic, though, just a couple logistical things. I already mentioned this is a live stream we do every week, same time, same place. We use this live interview to get reformatted and repurposed and put into our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which is released every Wednesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, as well as audio podcast platforms. So you're getting to be part of the live production by being here today. So thank you for joining. Second of all, if you could just drop in the chat here today where you're joining from today. I'd love to hear what city and country you're joining from. It's always fun to hear where our global audience is from here today. So if you wouldn't mind just dropping in the chat wherever you're from, I'd love to see that. And also, as it relates to chat, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat here as we are talking, and I'm going to take questions from the audience. So whatever platform you're watching or listening on, please feel free to drop your comments and questions here in the chat. I'd love to hear from you and love to get to your specific questions. So as I mentioned, the topic today is customer rights and responsibilities within digital transformation. And just to set the backdrop for today's conversation, it's commonly known that most digital transformations fail. I don't think that's much of a surprise to most of us. In fact, most statistics show that upwards of 80% or more of digital transformations fail. And it's easy to blame a lot of different parties or a lot of different things for failures. But what I want to do today is talk about what is it that the implementing organizations have a responsibility to do on one hand. So on one hand, I want to cover what is it that implementing organizations are responsible for. In other words, what are the things that they can't get out of or shouldn't get out of because they're responsible for ensuring a certain amount of the critical success factors for a digital transformation. But on the other hand, I also want to cover what rights customers have. So implementing organizations have certain rights that they aren't often afforded. And I'll talk about some of those dynamics here within the industry that contribute to some of those lack of rights or lack of empowerment for organizations that are going through digital transformation. So I really look forward to the conversation here today. So again, two different angles. We're going to cover rights, which is what are those things that a customer has a right to that they're not getting, and then on the other hand, what are the responsibilities, the things that you can't abdicate, you can't just outsource. These are things that you have to own. And if you look at both sides of that equation, that's largely why so many of these projects fail, is because organizations aren't given rights by their software vendors. Software vendors in many ways are taking too much power or taking too much control of implementation. So I'm going to talk about what some of those dynamics are, what some of those variables are that you can and should control. And then I'm also going to talk about the responsibilities. What are the things that you're responsible for that no one else can be, that you as an implementing organization need to be responsible for? And lastly, but certainly not least important, I also want to make sure we cover today what you think. What are your thoughts around what are the rights and the responsibilities of organizations? So I guess I would ask you to drop in the chat, if you don't mind, just what are some of your knee-jerk reactions to what either the rights or the responsibilities or both are for organizations that are going through digital transformations. I'll sort of share with you and unpack my thoughts and my initial comments and list here, but would love to hear your comments here. So please drop that in the chat. I'd love to get to that and sort of use that to stimulate some conversation here in the various platforms that we're streaming to here today. So I want to start off with rights. So I want to maybe take it from a perspective of what are those things that you as an organization, if you're implementing new technology, let's say it's an ERP system or CRM or HR system, supply chain, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter what technology you might be deploying. This is a technology agnostic conversation for sure. But what are those rights you have as an implementing organization? And I'll kind of go through five that I've identified or want to use as a starting point here, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. But the first thing that I have on my list here is that it's your digital transformation. So that's a really important context setting backdrop that's important to unpack a bit, which is that when you're going through a transformation, a lot of times there's a feeling that the system integrator owns the project. It's their project because they're the experts and they are the ones that come in to deploy technology. But at the end of the day, this is your business. Your business is what is leaning on this new technology to make it better. And so there's key decisions and control and ownership that you have a right to have for any given project. We have one client in particular, just to give you a quick backstory of sort of an extreme example of this right not being adhered to or being a failure point for one of our clients. We have a very large client right now that's going through a large tier one ERP implementation involving SAP, and they have a large system integrator that's helping them implement. And one of the interesting dynamics that we see with this client is that this big system integrator has insisted, and they have it actually written in their contract, that they are in control of the project. They own the project. They determine the staffing. They determine how the project's going to go, and the client agreed to it. And so that's creating a lot of problems because, first of all, you don't have ownership of the project when you've outsourced and you've given that much control to a system integrator. And second of all, it's not, you've got a lack of alignment. You have a problem here because you've got an outside third party who doesn't know your business and what you're trying to accomplish, who's trying to force fit technology in a way that they're used to deploying that doesn't necessarily align with the client's interests. And that's exactly what this particular client is going through. And this might be an extreme example in this case because it's actually a contractual situation where they've actually agreed to it contractually to allow the system integrator to have more control than they probably should. And most clients don't go that far, but what we do commonly see is organizations give and cede too much control to clients, and they don't take ownership or they don't have the ability to take ownership. Or in some cases, they don't even think to tell themselves that this is our transformation. This is our project. We're the ones that should be determining how this project goes. Yes, we should be leaning on third parties and experts as needed, but ultimately you have to own it and you have to treat it as your transformation. So that's a right that organizations I think should have, which is to own the transformation and have it be their transformation. It sounds super simple, super basic. It sounds like a no-brainer as I'm saying it, but it's fascinating to me how few organizations recognize that and actually take action accordingly and manage accordingly. Somewhat similar to that whole thread of this being your transformation and the implementing organization having a right to own the project. Similar to that is a second thing on my list here, which is you decide the pace and the tempo. So if you are going through a project, let's just say you've selected an ERP system and you get a proposal from a software vendor or system integrator that says, we can implement this technology in 18 months. They probably can implement technology in 18 months. That's not really the question. The question is, how well can this technology be implemented within your organization to actually be consumed by and adopted by your organization? And in this case, when a proposal or when a software vendor suggests something like 18 months, it's typically going to take a lot longer than that to get full adoption and actually get a real implementation in place. Not because the technology can't be configured and built in that amount of time, but because the organization itself typically can't go through change that quickly. And so what oftentimes happens is you get a system integrator or software vendor who comes in and says, hey, we can do this in 18 months or whatever the number is or whatever the duration is. And organizations say, okay, that sounds great. Let's do it in 18 months. And then they quickly realize this is a lot of change. This is typically moving too fast than our organization is capable of moving. And the technology is moving at a pace that's faster than we can change our people and our processes. And they tend to not want to or don't feel confident enough to slow things down and say, look, we need to slow this down. We might need to downsize the team to move at a slower pace, and maybe this ends up taking 24 months or 36 months or whatever the number is. Organizations don't feel comfortable doing that, partly because they've already committed now to an 18-month duration or whatever the unrealistic duration was, and now it's difficult to backpedal from that. And so it's really important, though, to set that pace and tempo in a way that makes sense to you as an organization, because at the end of the day, this is, again, your business, your organization. And if you go too fast and too aggressive in your transformation, it's your operations that are at risk. The software vendor and system integrator are not at risk. If your business fails or if you are unable to ship product or satisfy customer demand, it's you that's on the hook for that. So ultimately, you have to treat the project accordingly and make sure that you're managing risk and managing the project in a way that is palatable to your organization. And again, this is a situation where you have a right as an organization to determine what that duration is. It's not the software vendor. It's not the system integrator. They can make suggestions and proposals, but ultimately you have to decide and define what is the right pace, the right tempo, the right strategy for us as an organization. The third thing that organizations have a right to, in my opinion, is that they have a right to know what the software can really do. And this sounds, again, like a basic no-brainer sort of a thing. It might sound like common sense, but this is a really important overlooked one, in that software vendors themselves oftentimes don't fully understand what their technology can and can't do, especially today where a lot of the big software vendors are in the midst of a transition of moving all their legacy systems on premise to the cloud. So you've got these systems out there that are not fully baked, they're not fully developed, they're not fully mature. And you as an organization have a right to know where those gaps are. In every system out there, and when I say every, I literally mean every, I'm not exaggerating. Every system out there has deficiencies, it has gaps, it has problems. Not because it's a poorly written software, not because the software vendor is bad, nothing like that. It's because no one system can handle everything you're going to need it to do. So it's going to have deficiencies, it's going to have gaps. And especially today where you've got these cloud solutions that are still being developed and still trying to catch up to decades of on-premise functionality that had been developed over decades and billions of dollars of R&D. Now you've got these gaps that need to be exposed. You need to know what those gaps are, and you have a right to know what those gaps are, because you have to figure out how you're going to run your business without that functionality that you might be looking for. So really knowing and understanding and getting an honest assessment of what the software can and can't do is something that I would put in my sort of customer bill of rights, if you will. You know, these are the deal breakers, or the things that every organization has a right to. Similar to that, the fourth thing on my list is right to transparency. So every organization has a right to transparency in terms of what the system integrator is doing, how they're staffing the project, why they're staffing the project they are, what their approach is, what their deliverables are. There tends to be a dynamic in the industry, and I was part of this dynamic. So I'm throwing stones at glass houses in some ways, because I was part of this machinery early in my career. But when I was part of the big five or the big four consulting firms, and this is still the case today, we see it all the time. There's an art that these big system integrators have mastered, which is to sort of create a dynamic of don't look behind the curtain. Let us do our job. Let us create the technology. Let's build the technology. Let us deploy it. We're the experts. You hired us to be the experts. Trust us. And to some degree, you do want to trust. Obviously, you're hiring someone because you trust them. You want to partner with them. But in my opinion, oftentimes, more often than not, system integrators and vendors take that too far. They take it way too far and really don't have that accountability and transparency that should go along with a healthy partnership and a healthy transformation. And so that's another right that organizations have that they don't capitalize on, or they don't insist on, in my opinion, enough in the industry, which is a right to have that transparency into what a system integrator is doing. Why do you have, for example, if you've got a large implementation and a system integrator has 50 people, let's say full-time on a project, let's question, why are there 50 people? Do we need all 50 of those? Are we overstaffing? Are we trying to move too quickly with more people, when in fact maybe a lower staffing level over a longer duration might make more time? Let's talk through that. And so those are the sorts of dynamics and conversations that really need to happen that don't happen enough in the industry, but yet implementing organizations do have the right to that. And then finally, a fifth one that's very consistent with the others that I've mentioned so far in terms of the theme here is that implementing organizations have a right to manage their system integrators and their vendors. So in other words, the vendors and the system integrators don't have a right to control your project. That's just not their right, unless for some reason, as in the case that I just gave or the example I gave a moment ago, if you've agreed to it contractually, that's a different story. I would highly encourage you not to agree to that contractually, but assuming you haven't, then you have a right to manage the system integrator. You have a right to manage them. They don't manage you. And again, this is a hard one because they're the experts, you're not. They go through transformations all the time, you don't. And so the question then becomes, well, how do I do that? How can I manage the system integrator if I'm not the expert? And again, the point here is that I'm not suggesting that every organization needs to become experts in digital transformation in order to manage their system integrators. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I am saying is that even though they are the experts, you do need to manage them. You need to ask questions. You need to challenge them. You need to hold them accountable. You need to put PMO in place, program management and governance in place to manage and put guardrails in place for those system integrators. You have a right to put quality assurance mechanisms in place. You have a right to bring in other third parties if you need to augment what the system integrator can't do or shouldn't be doing. So that's another dynamic that's very unhealthy in the industry, but I challenge organizations that are going through transformations to push back against it, in that there's a common line of thinking, which is that if I'm the system integrator, I own this project. You don't have a right to manage me. You don't have a right to bring in other third parties. You don't have a right to put program management or governance and controls in place. And that is absolutely not true. You have every right in the world to do that. So that's one thing that is important too, that oftentimes gets overlooked. So these are my 5. I'm starting with the rights part of it, and then I'm going to get to responsibilities in the second half of our conversation here today. In terms of sort of flipping a little bit right now, I'm being a little hard on the system integrators and the vendors, talking about the things that they sort of violate in terms of customer rights. But I also want to flip the switch here in a moment, and I'm going to talk about what are the things that a lot of organizations, or too many organizations, push off or outsource or abdicate responsibility for, try to wash their hands clean of, that they shouldn't be. So I'm not here just to blame vendors. I'm also going to point some more blame at implementing organizations here in a moment. But what I want to do is really go to the audience here and just see what other rights do customers have. What are your thoughts here on beyond what I've talked about, or maybe building on anything I've talked about, anything you might agree or disagree with? I'd love to hear that too. Before I get to those audience questions, though, I want to thank you all for dropping the chat where you're from, just to give you a sample representation of where people are joining from today. Throughout the world, we have Twana from Sweden, Sam from Spain, Ghassan from Kuwait, Ryan from Denver. We have Torben from Denmark, Trevor from Nova Scotia, someone from Felix, England, someone from Atlanta, Malcolm from the UK, Greg from Atlanta. Just a few examples here. Deborah from France. Thank you all for being here throughout the world. I really appreciate it, and hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. So I want to get to just a few comments that have already started to roll in since we started going through my points or my initial thoughts on what customer rights are in a digital transformation. And the first one I want to cover here is from Sam, who's joining us from Spain, in that customer or companies just have the right to expect that implementing consultants are properly trained and not just on their job as a chargeable resource to gain experience. So in other words, you have a right to have consultants on your project that know what they're doing, that you're not paying to train. And I'll give you a quick backstory about my experience, which again, this is sort of hard to admit given everything I'm talking about right here and everything that we at Third Stage stand for. But early in my career, when I was first starting out, I was one of those consultants that just got off the school bus, just got certified as an SAP consultant, and I was coming in to do some SAP change management work. But I was learning most of what I was doing on the job, and I was billing a high rate by the hour, and the client was paying for me to learn. Now, of course, every consultant has a learning curve and a trajectory in their career, and some are more experienced than others. You're always going to have that. But there's a fine line between, paying a junior resource who's not as experienced compared to a more senior resource that charges more. That's part of why there's a delta in the rates. But even if you're paying a relatively low rate for a junior consultant, you have a right to have consultants that know what they're doing. And if you don't, then that's where you start to push back and say, do I need to be paying for this consultant, or why am I paying for this consultant to learn on the job? And maybe just taking it a step further, at the risk of sounding a bit micromanagey, if that's a word, which I know it's not. But if you have a consulting team on a project from your system integrator, you have a right to challenge and to know and have visibility to what the roles and responsibilities of all those consultants are, what their skill sets are, ensuring that they're the right fit for the project. It's so common that you see in the industry that you have consultants that are either incompetent or incapable of doing their jobs, or they're just not good cultural fits with your organization, or they create conflict with the team. And there's a sense of helplessness that organizations have, like, well, I can't do anything about it because that's my partner. I've got a contract with my system integrator for them to do A, B, and C. And that's why I encourage organizations all the time to step in and to challenge and to shape and help mold what the team looks like. Again, it's not your system integrator's project; it's your project, and you determine how that's going to go. It's sort of like if you're getting work done on your house and you hired a contractor, and you were paying by the hour, and you didn't have any sort of guarantee that the cost was going to be within any sort of reasonable time frame. If you had, say, 20 people show up on the job and you noticed half of them standing around and you knew you were paying for all these resources, you probably start to question, why am I paying for these 10 people to stand around and do nothing? But yet, when we're an organization and we go through transformation, we don't have that same mentality or that same confidence in challenging it. And so that's one thing that I always encourage organizations to do, is to gain some confidence and to build that strength to be able to challenge an SI, and not in a combative way, but in a constructive way, to say, look, we need to understand why these junior resources are on the project. Or even if it's not a junior resource, it may be the number of resources, it may be the cultural fit or lack thereof. You can challenge those things, and you should be challenging those things, because again, this is your business and only you know your business and what you're trying to accomplish. Here's another interesting comment here in terms of adding to our list of customer rights in a transformation. This is from Gassan on LinkedIn. He says, you have a right to control the digital transformation project and the rights to intellectual property. It's a really interesting one. I can comment more on the right to control the digital transformation project. I totally agree with that. I highly encourage organizations to establish some sort of PMO function or program management, program governance that the SI or the vendors fall within. Too often, system integrators and vendors will say, don't worry about that. We got it. We've got a project manager that's going to come in and do that for you. Well, the problem with that is, first of all, there's a difference between a project and a program. The project manager that a system integrator or vendor provides is to manage a technology work stream. And there's several work streams within a transformation. Technology is just one of them. You don't need or want, nor should you have your system integrator managing the non-technical work streams. So things like change management or process improvement or the overall PMO, even overall system architecture, even data migration. Those are things that you typically want to have specialists or other parties that are better at it to manage that. And so again, this gets back to the point of, you have to manage that stuff. You have to find a way to manage that, either with your internal resources or with outside help or whatever the case may be. As it relates to intellectual property, I guess there's a fine line there. I suppose if you develop your own customization, there's a question there of who owns that intellectual property. I am not an attorney, and if there are already attorneys that happen to be on the line here today, I'd love to hear your comments here. In fact, I noticed that Kyler on LinkedIn tagged Marcus Harris, who is a prominent IP attorney. He also does a lot with digital transformations. He's been on my podcast before. I'm not sure if he's on the stream, but if he is, I'd love to hear his legal advice, even though I'm sure he can't give free legal advice over a live stream, but maybe he can give us some thoughts or things to think about if he's on here today. So here's the question we had that Kyler on LinkedIn had for Marcus, which is, have you seen this contracting issue before? How can organizations avoid it? I'm not sure which contracting issue that's referring to, since I'm not seeing the reply that's to. Here's a question I want to get to from William on, he's on YouTube. So William has a comment here, or a question: how often do clients poorly define their success expectations contractually? Assumptions made but not written down. Integrator fulfills to the letter, problems ensue, I should say. So that's the question there, the comment. And I would say, and again, this is another question from Marcus, who I see is joining us on LinkedIn. I just saw him in the chat here, and I'll get to his comment on another unrelated thing here in a minute. But this is another thing that Marcus might have a good comment here on. In fact, I probably should have just had Marcus as a guest to talk through this. But so the comment of how do clients poorly define their success expectations contractually? And I'd say that's very common that organizations do that they poorly define their success expectations. I think too often the focus is on a deliverable, a technical deliverable, which again might be okay because really you're hiring your vendor to create a technical deliverable. The problem typically isn't that the success expectations in the contract are wrong for that work stream or for that job or that role that you're hiring a contractor or a system integrator for. But the problem is you don't have any parties or any contractual relationships with anyone else to fill in all the other gaps. So it's not necessarily always the case that you need the SI or the vendor to be providing more clear success factors that are outside their scope. But the problem is you've entered into a contract that's very myopic and focused on creating a technical deliverable rather than a business transformation, which most organizations are looking for a business transformation. So the technical deliverables end up becoming a means to a greater end. And so I don't know if that answers that question or not. I'd say part of it is a contractual issue, but part of it is also that you don't have the gaps filled in other areas outside of that one contractual relationship with your software vendors. And on a related comment here, this is from Marcus on LinkedIn. Marcus Harris is the attorney I was just mentioning. He hit his IP, digital transformation, software negotiation, all that sort of thing. That's just this everything we're talking about here is sort of his specialty on the legal side. And his comment here is that the SOW or the statement of work is one of the most important documents you will negotiate. It needs to lay out the roles and responsibilities of both parties. So that actually does begin to address William's point just a moment ago from LinkedIn, or from YouTube. So thank you for that comment, Marcus. And I think we're gonna have more questions for you as we go through here. Dennis from LinkedIn says that he loves the fifth point. And by the way, I have to call out Dennis because Dennis Anthony on LinkedIn, who's watching right now, this was his idea. This whole topic was his idea. It's a suggestion that I received from him. I actually meant to say that up front. So apologies I didn't mention that earlier, Dennis. But if you want to thank someone for a great, brilliant idea, you can ping Dennis, who I have his name up here on the screen. If you hate the idea and you hate this topic, you can blame me instead. But hopefully that's not the case. Okay. So here's another interesting comment from Ghassan. So Ghassan says that you have a right to privacy, no data to be leaked during the digital transformation project. Great point. That was not even on my radar, not even something I thought of, but it's a very good point. As I did not think of that as a thread when I was preparing for this discussion, but it's a really important one, the right to privacy and making sure that your data doesn't leak along the way. And not only that, but maybe taking it a step further, you also have a right to make sure that your project is implemented in a way that preserves that data privacy and gives you the tools to manage and ensure that going forward, even after the transformation, that you have tools and technologies in place that won't have any cybersecurity or privacy issues going forward. So here's a comment from Kyler on LinkedIn, and she says you have a right to select. Customers have the right to select their team. Cultural fit is critical, and so many times we see vendors force fit PMs and support teams to bill at a higher rate. You have the right to select your team. It should be collaborative. That's very well said. Again, too often organizations or system integrators have this sort of don't look behind the curtain mentality. They're going to bring the team. They're the experts. You've got to trust us. Stop challenging us. Just let us do our thing. And yes, you need to trust to some degree, but I'd say if you take the trust but verify approach, too many organizations lean way too far toward trust and not nearly enough toward verify and sort of validating that they've got the right approach and poking holes and challenging and collaborating where necessary. And again, I know there's a fine line between being super micromanaged or focused on micromanagement versus trusting a outside third party. But again, I think too many organizations are erring on the side of trusting too much. And in my opinion, that trust gets violated more often than not along the way. A couple other comments here from Ghassan again, intellectual property for customizations and property. So that's a question that actually we had for Marcus too. If you're listening, Marcus, is if a customer customizes software, does something to create something unique within a transformation and they're using a software vendor to develop that for them, who owns the IP, or is that something you should negotiate in a contract? I guess that would be more of a question for Marcus if he's listening, has any semi-legal advice for us on that front. Another comment here from Dennis again on LinkedIn, and thank you for all the great comments, by the way. There's a lot here, so I really appreciate the active feedback here. Dennis says you have a right to raise questions of the system integrators and get the reply from the OEM software company if the answer is not satisfactory. So if you're implementing Microsoft Dynamics, let's just say, and you're using a system integrator to implement, system integrator doesn't have a good answer, they can't figure out a certain function, they can't figure out how to do something that the software can or should do, then you have a right to go to the software company, in this case Microsoft in this example, to ensure that you get the answer you need. And that's a really important one too, because again, in this transition state that the industry is in right now, where we're transitioning from on-premise to cloud solutions, total rewrites of the software in most cases, you're just getting situations where even the more experienced implementation and technical consultants don't fully understand the software, partly because it's changing and evolving every day, but also because a lot of that capability is not yet developed and it's still being formulated and built as we speak. So you do have a right, and you want to make sure you lean on your software vendor if you can't get what you need or the knowledge you need from the system integrator themselves. So that's good stuff. There's a lot there about, what some of these customer rights are, but I want to shift gears here for the second part of our conversation. And before I do that though, a really good comment that just came in, I want to get to is that, this is from Sam on LinkedIn. He says customers should have the right to have their own consultants monitor the SI's consultants. Great point. And it's a great add-on to my earlier point around managing the SI. And you're right. I think that was my fifth point. You're right to manage the system integrator, to put PMO and governance in place, a right to put quality assurance in place, a right to bring on third-party consultants to either do what you're saying, Sam, which is to manage the system integrator and make sure that you're translating your business needs into technology results, but also filling in the gaps and helping fill the void that is left by SIs. There's certain things that they don't do well or shouldn't be doing, things like organizational change and program management and process improvement, things of that nature. So those are that's a really good add-on point there. So I want to shift gears now and talk a bit about some of the responsibilities customers have. So up until now, I've been fairly hard on the vendors and system integrators, and maybe giving, maybe erring on the side of what the customers are not getting that they should be getting from system integrators and what rights they should be getting. But now I want to talk about the things that organizations should be doing and that they're responsible for that they too often don't do. They try to abdicate responsibility. They try to wash their hands clean. They try to outsource it to someone else. And these are the things that you can't do that with. At least if you want to be successful, you can't or shouldn't be doing this stuff. There's actually more of these than I had, at least on my list. There's more responsibilities here than I had in my list of rights. So the first is your responsibility to do your due diligence. Just because a software vendor tells you something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And I don't say that because I think vendors or SIs typically lie consciously or intend to lie or mislead, although sometimes they do. But more often than not, it's a lack of knowledge. It's a overly optimistic view of the world that they have, and it's an overly biased view of the world that they have, being focused on their technology and their sorts of implementation. And it's your job to do your due diligence and validate what you're hearing and poke holes in what you're hearing and make sure you fully understand what it is you're really getting yourself into. Because again, it's easy to trust, especially when you don't go through these projects every day. And it's more important to ensure that you also verify in the trust but verify line of thinking here. A second thing is to define a realistic plan, budget, and resources. So again, software vendors and SIs are going to come to you with these proposals that are 9 times out of 10, if not more, they're unrealistic, they're understated, they're lowballed, and it's going to underestimate and create a false expectation of what it's going to take to get the project done right. Partly because there's a couple reasons. One is that partly because the software is typically implemented and designed and built in a way that can be done faster than an organization can actually start to use technology. And those are two different things. Getting a deliverable of technology that works is different than getting a deliverable of technology that works and is now being used by the organization to drive business value and to run the business. Those are two different things and two different deliverables and two different outcomes. So if I get a proposal from a system integrator or software vendor that says, this is a timeline, this is a budget, this is the resource requirement, chances are pretty high that that's to create a myopic deliverable of technology. It's not to create a business adopted technology in a true business transformation. Those are two different things. So you have to create or add a grain of salt to what the vendors have proposed to you to create that full picture of what the full transformation is going to look like. An even more fundamental reason why the plan and budget and resource proposals that you get from software vendors are so often understated is because they're in sales mode when they provide those to you. They are trying to sell you on their services. They're trying to sell you on the value of their technology. And they can't really do that well if they worry that they're overstating the risk or the cost or the time it's going to take to go through an implementation. So they're more often than not going to give you the best case, overly optimistic utopia scenario. And so you have to take it with a grain of salt and say, well, maybe it's possible to implement our technology in 18 months, but we know our organization and what we're trying to accomplish with this transformation, and maybe 36 months is more realistic. It's not a terrible thing to add time to your timeline as long as you're managing and being aggressive in how you manage the project, and you're not just letting time get away from you. You obviously need to have a sense of urgency, but there's a difference between having a sense of urgency and having a completely unrealistic plan. Those are two different challenges. So the second one then is defining a realistic plan, budget, and resources. The third responsibility, which is similar to one of the rights you have, but it's also a responsibility, is to manage your system integrator and implementer. And back to Sam's point on LinkedIn, if that means that you hire a third-party, independent, neutral consulting firm like Third Stage, and there's others out there as well, so this isn't meant to be totally self-fulfilling or self-promoting, although I am self-promoting. You have a right to do that. You have a right to hire someone like Third Stage to manage your SI, to manage your implementer, and to really help represent you and really be an extension of you and your PMO and ensure that you have ownership and control of the project. So you have a right to that. SIs do not like it. To be 100% clear, SIs do not like you to have a third party in there. It creates accountability. It takes away that curtain, the curtain of don't look behind the curtain, Wizard of Oz sort of thing. That goes away for the SIs, and they don't like that. They also don't like anything that is perceived to threaten their revenue stream. These big projects, especially the bigger client you are, there's more at stake, and they're going to try to protect their quote unquote turf, even though it's not their turf, it's your turf, but that's a whole nother conversation. But SIs will work very hard to protect their turf. That was one of the first things I noticed when I went to Price Waterhouse back in the 90s, is I was fascinated and disturbed at the same time by how much time we spent. And by the way, billed the client for this time, by the way, which is another whole nother problem and story for another time. But we would bill the client to find ways to protect our turf. It was a very political, highly political situation, and we were very good at it. I couldn't believe how good that PwC was, and our team and every project I was on was very good at just keeping outside third parties out, keeping that curtain up, making the customer feel confident and comfortable without challenging us in any sort of meaningful way. And it was super unhealthy, and it didn't make sense to me at the time, and still 25 years later, still doesn't make sense to me now. In fact, it makes even less sense to me now. So you have a right to manage your system integrator and your implementer. Again, think of if you're having work done in your house. You're not just going to open up a checkbook and let whoever come into your house, as many people as the contractor wants to bring. You're not going to do that. You're going to push back and say, look, I don't want to pay for A, B, and C, or we're being inefficient over here, or over here you're not making these adjustments to my house the way you want. I think we as individuals would probably feel pretty comfortable pushing back on something like that. But for whatever reason, organizations and the organizational dynamics that most organizations have create this learned helplessness and this lack of confidence in ability to do that, even though we would probably do exactly that if it was a personal situation. A fourth responsibility that organizations have is to define what you want to be when you grow up. So in other words, don't go in and buy technology and assume that that's going to define for you what your future state organization is going to be. You need to have a very clear vision of what it is you're trying to accomplish, not just strategically, but also operationally, business process-wise, organizationally. You need to have a clear vision of what it is you're trying to accomplish and what you want the organization to look like. And you also need to make sure you take the time to do those things that you're trying to do. So again, it's not just a matter of hiring an SI and a vendor to come in and slam in some new technology. You need to take that time up front to plan that stuff out and to have a clear path, clear vision and future state operating model and a future state organizational design that you're going to execute to. You have a right to do that, or you have a responsibility to do that early in your project. Related to that, a fifth thing then is to get alignment internally. You have to make sure you're aligned internally, and that's not something that a system integrator is going to do for you. And the less aligned you are, and the more involved the system integrator gets, the more expensive your lack of alignment becomes. What I mean by that is system integrator brings on army of consultants to start designing and building stuff. You aren't aligned as a team. You haven't defined your future state. You don't know what you want to be when you grow up. You can't get on the same page. Guess who's paying for that while you try to figure it out? It's not the software vendor or the system integrator that's harmed by that. It's you that's harmed by that, because now you're paying while the meter runs on the system integrator and the software subscription fees. The meter is running. The dollars are adding up while you're sitting there trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up, and you're trying to get on the same page. So your job, your responsibility is to get alignment and to do that before you start jumping too far into the implementation, before the really heavy spend starts to ramp up on a project. You need to make sure you have that alignment, and too few organizations do that. The other thing, and a second to last responsibility I have in my list here, is to do the things that your system integrator can't, won't, and or shouldn't do. So in other words, your SI fills a role. You imagine a big project org chart. You've got your PMO up top. You've got different work streams like technology. You've got change management, data migration, architecture, process improvement, a bunch of different verticals. You also have third-party or other bolt-on systems, especially if you're doing a best-of-breed sort of situation. You might have multiple technology work streams. So the SI fills one box in your project org chart. You have a right and a responsibility to figure out how you're going to fill in those other gaps. SI may tell you, don't worry about change management. We got it. We're going to train your people on the technology. That's not change management. That's a very small subset of change management. That's not change management. SI might tell you, don't worry about program management. We've got a project manager. They do project management of one box on a project org chart. They do not do program management. So your responsibility is to figure out, how am I going to fill these gaps? How am I going to add that layer of program management? How am I going to add the change management I need? How am I going to figure out the data migration? How am I going to define that shared service model that I'm moving towards, or that standard one company business process model that we're moving towards? That's up to you to determine, and then you translate that into what the SI needs to know to be able to build the software to do their part of their box on the project org chart. So that's another responsibility, is to make sure that you do the things and find ways to address the things that the system integrator can't, won't, or shouldn't do. And then finally, the last thing I have on my list, and then I'll turn it to the audience here to see what you would add to the list, is to establish a PMO, or a program management organization. So again, it's back to the point, technology work stream, fine. You've got a project manager from your vendor or system integrator. You've got a technical project manager that's going to manage that work stream, but now you've got to figure out the overall PMO. What's my project charter? What's my overall program plan that includes all the different pieces of my transformation, not just the SI or the vendors? How am I going to do the change management, all that stuff? So you need that PMO, you need the project charter, you need the program plan, you need the resourcing plan, the overall strategy, the governance and the framework and controls, the risk mitigation. That's another huge one. That system integrators don't really want you to have too much visibility or transparency into what the risks are. In fact, they're going to work very hard to downplay those risks. That's something else I learned early in my career, is that how much time we would spend spinning risks and bad news. We were really good at making bad news sound not that bad. And what you're doing is you're kicking the can down the road, and it's going to catch up to you some point. But as a system integrator, I'm trying to protect my revenue stream. If I create too much alarm, too much risk, the last thing I need is a disruption to my revenue stream. So I'm going to find a way to push that out and to minimize and downplay that risk. But what you as an organization need to know is, you need to know that risk sooner than anyone's willing to tell you. You need to know the risks up front so you can mitigate them quickly, because by the time you realize that the risks are there, and by the time you start to feel it, it's usually too late. Usually by then there's no turning back, or you're getting massive delays in your project, or massive disruption to your operations when you go live. There's just too much disruption if you push that out. So it's in your best interest to identify risks as early as possible, even if It's not what you or anyone wants to hear. And none of us want to hear the risks, of course, but someone has to be talking about and mitigating those risks. So those are my list of responsibilities. Again, there's more responsibilities, I'd say, than rights, at least in my opinion, or in my initial list preparing for this conversation. But those are just some of the things that come to mind. So I'm curious to hear from you, though. What are some of the other responsibilities that you think customers have, or what are the other responsibilities that you've seen customers fail on in terms of their transformations? I'd love to hear your feedback there as well. Here's a long comment. I'm not going to show it on the screen just because it won't show, but it's a really good one. So I want to make sure I get to it here. And this is from Sam on LinkedIn again. Sam says, I've spoken to too many companies who, when they bought an ERP system, didn't understand what they had bought. Some thought that they would have the equivalent of the computer from the Starship Enterprise sitting in the corner, solving all their problems, whilst others didn't ask for enough. Customers must educate themselves before the project starts. It's really well said. And I think you hit on a really important point, and you blatantly or explicitly call it out in a way that I haven't yet, which is your last point, which is that customers must educate themselves before the project starts. And I think that's probably the best way to empower yourself too. The more you know, and the more you have an unbiased understanding of the good, the bad, the ugly of what you're getting into, the more empowered you're going to feel, and the more you're going to be able to fulfill these rights and responsibilities that I'm talking about here today. I think probably if we had to get to a root cause of why these problems exist, I think Sam just hit on it, which is that too few organizations have the knowledge, so they lack the knowledge they need to feel empowered or to feel confident to do all the things I'm talking about here today. It's really hard to push back on your SI and your vendor if you don't know anything about transformations or you don't know anything about technology. You've never done this sort of project before. And that's okay. It's not that, most organizations don't do this often, and most organizations haven't done it much at all in recent years. And they're doing this for the first time, in some cases, the first time in decades. They're going through a transformation of some sort. So it's not that you would expect an organization to have all this knowledge out of the gates, but you can find ways to educate yourself. Bring in those third parties that will help educate you. Bring in those third parties that will help represent you and arm you and equip you with the tools and the knowledge and the confidence you need to be able to do all the things we're talking about here today, to manage the SI, to understand the good, the bad, the ugly of what technology you're deploying, and to really just have that transparency and confidence that you need. I think that's a really well stated comment, Sam. So thank you for that. Bear with me. I'm trying to read. There's a lot of comments here, so I'm just trying to cherry pick some here. They're all very good comments. There's another comment from Dennis, which is interesting. Dennis on LinkedIn. This is, again, the originator of this idea is this Dennis right here on LinkedIn. The idea for this conversation, I should say. So Dennis says, support the SI to document the functional and technical documentation, not make it the SIs to prepare, which only he or she understands. Great point. Really well said. And I think that's a key thing here, maybe just pushing or adding onto my comment earlier about the right to transparency and the right to visibility into what an SI is doing. Customers have that right, and the way to do that is to work side by side or more closely with the SI to create some of these deliverables. One thing that SIs do, which is brilliant, but I'd say in a sociopathic way, not in a good way. SIs are really good at making customers feel like they are being collaborative. Like they'll come out with these org charts that say, okay, here's our project org chart. We're gonna put our PM in place. We're gonna have all these functional leads, and I forgot what they call it. I think a lot of them call it two in a box, I think is what the term that a lot of the big SIs use. They'll call it two in a box. So we're gonna put two people in each of these boxes on an org chart, and one's gonna be from us, the SI. The other one's gonna be from you, the client. And you look at that and you think, that's great. That's exactly what we want. We want that collaboration. We want to work side by side with you. The problem there is it's overstating the role of the second person in the box. It's overstating the role of the SI or of the implementing organization. And instead, what it is that the implementing organization becomes more of just a subject matter expert that's answering questions about how to configure the software. But that second person in the box on the org chart isn't typically heavily involved in actually doing configuration and learning side by side with how to configure the software or how to document what's been configured and just how to learn the software in general. It goes back to that don't look behind the curtain mentality that SIs have. It's, yes, we need you to a certain degree, but we need you to go away and let us do our thing beyond that. And I think pushing into that and really pressing on that dynamic, that unhealthy sociopathic trend or that behavior is something that's very important, because that is something that's going to enable you to really have that ownership and have that knowledge, and to eventually work to have consultants go away. And that's one thing that at third stage, that's one of our, as weird as it sounds and as damaging to us personally as it may sound, our job is to work ourselves out of a job. So we need to we need to not make clients overly dependent on us in a codependent, unhealthy sort of a way. But we need to be successful at empowering them and making them able to manage this stuff on their own so that we can go away and it's not going to disrupt their business. And the irony of all that, by the way, just as a side note, is the more we do that, I'm finding the more business we get from those same clients. They want to hire us because they trust us. So they'll end up hiring us back anyway. So if we just keep working ourselves out of a job, they're going to bring us back for something else because they like us so much, and there's other needs that are going to evolve over time. And so I've just found that it's almost, in the short term, you have to be sort of anti-self motivated, which is going to lead to more self-interest later on. So unfortunately, most SIs don't do that, though. They're focused on the here and now of like, this is a massive multi-million-dollar contract for us, and we are going to do everything possible to protect that and maximize that contract to get as much revenue out of that as we can. And I guess we could have a philosophical, ethical debate another time of whether that's intentional or not, or, whether it's understandable human behavior, but that's a whole nother conversation, which might actually be fun to have sometime. Here's a really interesting question from Deborah on LinkedIn. It's good to see Deborah again. She has been on many of our streams in the past, so good to see you again, Deborah. So I'm going to hide the question here for a second, because just so I can read the whole thing. So I'll hide it off the screen here. But Deborah on LinkedIn says, it's interesting that the SIs are the bad actors in many of these scenarios. In my market, there is not a lot of experience with my product, so we see clients who hire a third-party PMO with absolutely zero experience with the product, and they end up hindering the project and hurting the client's interest. It's a great point, and that is absolutely another challenge that I have not mentioned, but it is something you have to be aware of, is you hire a third-party expert, let's say a program management or project management consultant that they're good at project management. They're not necessarily experts in technology or a certain type of technology, but they're good at program management. That can be damaging as well, because the thing with program management is there is a science to it. Of course, you've got your tasks, your dependencies, your budget. You've got to track to your earned value, the earned value analysis and percent completion and all that stuff. So there is a science to it, but so much of transformation is an art. It's a learned art, and it's something that doesn't show up in a Gantt chart. Doesn't show up in a readiness assessment necessarily. It doesn't show up in your budget. Where it shows up is in cases where, for example, I'm going to use test scenarios as an example. Let's just say I'm project managing, and I'm trying to assess user acceptance. I'm trying to measure the user acceptance of the testing. So we're doing conference room pilots. Let's say we're running through all these scenarios, and I go through the process, and I've got 100% acceptance. On paper, that looks like success. We can move on to the next part of the project. That's the science part of it. The art side of it would say, well, hold on, we got 100% acceptance, but do we have the right scenarios? Do we have an accurate representation of what the business needs are? Do the scenarios, have we documented, have we tested enough within those scenarios? And those are things that don't show up in my 100% metric, because my 100% metric suggests that I'm done and I've done this successfully. But the art side of it, the knowledge of the technology and the knowledge of digital transformation, would lead me to ask more questions around, well, first of all, 100% acceptance sounds a little sketchy and unbelievable if you've done this before, but that's what happens sometimes. You get a number like 100% acceptance, and you want to strive for that, of course, but it's rare that you actually get it. So that's red flag number one. And red flag number two would be, well, let's just challenge ourselves and make sure we've really looked at all the exceptions and all the different scenarios that we need to be looking at. So that's just one microcosm or one small example of how digital transformation and technical knowledge and technical experience is just as important as the program management experience too. So I think you're right, Deborah. I have been harsh on the SIs and vendors, and I would maybe throw another bucket of blame in any sort of third party that doesn't do this or doesn't understand this stuff and doesn't do it well. Sam Graham has a nice comment. I'm going to show it because it's self-serving. Sam says, Kyler, I check your website every week to read the articles that your team put up every day. So thank you for reading our blogs and website, Sam. I also encourage you to check out our YouTube channels as well, under my name, as well as Third Stage Consulting. I'm going to get to a couple more comments here. So many comments here. This is really good. I appreciate all the great comments here. It's borderline overwhelming, so thank you, especially being solo here today. This is another interesting comment from Kyler. One key responsibility is leadership. A digital mindset, innovation, transparency, support, alignment all comes from strong project leaders. It's great point. Something I did not highlight enough here, which is executive leadership, sponsorship, ownership, vision, all that stuff. That's another responsibility and a right too, by the way, but it's more a responsibility that organizations have. They have to create that clarity of vision and that strong project leadership in a project in order for it to be successful. Here's a comment from Trevor on YouTube. He says, I like the idea of a program. MO has taken off. I'm not sure what MO means, but I like the idea of a program. I'm going to skip the part I don't understand. I apologize for that. There are so many streams that need to be coordinated. A single project manager can't run a digital transformation project on their own. Totally agree with that, and thank you for the validation. I'm not totally crazy then, apparently. At least there's one other person that agrees with my comment about program management versus project management. So a lot to coordinate. And again, that's even if you don't have an internal PMO, which a lot of organizations, a lot of clients we work with don't have a PMO. So they say to us, well, we don't have a PMO. We don't have strong project managers. How are we going to do this? And that's back to the education and the coaching. That's where, when we work with clients at Third Stage, that's where we help them establish the PMO, or at least establish a program manager to manage that overall process and that overall project. And then I'm gonna pull up one more comment here, even though there's a ton here I should be getting to, and some really good questions I'm not going to get to, and I apologize for that. Another responsibility, according to Ghassan, which I agree with, another responsibility is to set up KPIs for project success. So great point. You want to talk about, what is it that you expect this project to look like, not just in terms of budget and being on time and on budget, but also more importantly, what do things look like after you've gone live with new technologies? What are those KPIs? How do you measure success? How do you declare victory? And what do you do when you fall short? That's the other thing, because you're not going to declare victory on day one or anywhere close to day one after go live. You're going to try and do it as quickly as possible, but you're going to have to go back and do some remediation and optimization to really get those metrics that you expect. And so setting those metrics and measuring and then remediating and optimizing after transformation, during and after transformation, is really important. So that's a really well said, well put statement there. So thank you for that. And thank you to everyone for providing great commentary here, great questions and additions to my thoughts. I think this is a really important topic, customer rights and responsibilities. Love the idea. And thank you again to Dennis Antony on LinkedIn for suggesting this topic. Hopefully you found it helpful. And again, you can find this interview in next Wednesday, a week from tomorrow. We'll publish an episode of Transformation Ground Control that will feature this discussion and this live discussion as part of that episode. So I encourage you to check that out. Subscribe to it if you don't already. You can find it on Google Podcast, Amazon Podcast, Spotify, et cetera, wherever you listen to podcasts, or we stream the podcast every Wednesday to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So be sure to check it out there. And you can also find it after the fact on my YouTube channel, as well as the Third Stage Consulting YouTube channel as well. So I want to thank everyone for joining here today. Thanks so much. Really appreciate the great feedback. Hope you found this information helpful. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday, same time, same place. We do these live streams to talk about digital transformation topics. So thank you for joining here today. Hope you all have a great week, and we will see you next time.